Hi, I'm Justin Patton from the Murray State University Recording Studio, and today we're in the Performing Arts Hall to talk about microphones. They're kind of the square one of recording. You don't do any recording if there's not a microphone somewhere to kick things off. Microphones have been compared to lots of different things. There's lots of analogies out there about microphones. They're like a painter's brush. They're like a sculptor's chisel. But maybe more relevant to today is they're like your Instagram filters. They're like the filters on your smartphone's camera. You know, when you take a picture and then you kind of just peruse through the different filters and see what it does and how it kind of changes the flavor, the color, the tone of your pictures. Microphones kind of do the same thing to sound. You're going to get the same basic idea no matter what microphone you use, but some microphones might be a much better choice than others. Just as an example, let's say that one of the world's best whatever players has just come into the studio and wants to lay down some tracks. First of all, you listen to this guy play the whatever and you think, wow, that's the best whatever I've ever heard. I've got to do it justice when I make this recording. I've got to pick the right microphone and put it in the right place. That's kind of when you feel a little bit like Indiana Jones from The Last Crusade. You walk into the room full of microphones and you think, somewhere here's the Holy Grail, and if I pick it, if I get the right answer, I'm going to have a great sound on this recording. That's partially true, but it's not completely true. There are a lot more things that you need to know besides just what the Holy Grail mic is for this instrument. The Holy Grail mic for that instrument will be different for that instrument given whatever the song is. If the song is going to focus on the whatever, let's call it the guitar. If it's going to be a guitar-focused song, especially a song that pretty much strips everything else away and the guitar tone becomes the prominent point of the song, I'll probably approach that a lot differently than if it's just going to be one of many, many instruments and is kind of relegated to the attack of the guitar creating a shaker effect, and it's just kind of a rhythmic thing. If that's how it's going to work, I'm probably going to pick a completely different microphone. So understanding how the instrument's going to fit into the final song has a lot to do with it too. So what are the different type of microphones? Well, the most common microphone is probably what you've seen all your life, whether you've realized it or not, on stages, on The Tonight Show, on Saturday Night Live. You will almost always see something like this. This microphone here is a Shure SM57. It's very common on anything from vocals to percussion to drums to toms to guitar amps. You can plug it into just about any type of microphone designed preamp and you're going to get good signal from a dynamic mic. No batteries required. Some of the characteristics of a dynamic mic, it's very sturdy. It has to be to deal with the day in, day out use on a live music stage. People drop these things, drummers whack them with a stick. They usually just keep on ticking. They're very rugged, they're very tough. They also do a really good job of isolating their sound source. So when you put this close to a snare, real close, there's not a whole lot of bleed getting into this from, say, the electric guitar. If you put a different type of microphone on the snare, you would probably get more bleed coming in from the electric guitar as the amp is sitting maybe 6-7 feet away on a live stage. A dynamic mic also handles sound pressure levels that are high. So when you do have this just an inch away from a snare and a wild man drummer is just beating the snare to death, the high sound pressure is not going to damage the microphone. One situation where a microphone needs to be at a great distance from the source is when you're recording a choir. You're not wanting to hear each individual voice, you want to hear the blend, and that's not going to happen with a microphone 3 feet away. So as you move the mic 10, 15, 20 feet away, a dynamic mic is generally going to sound pretty terrible at a great distance like that. If it's the only thing you have, then you got to go with it. But if you have the option for one of the other microphones we're about to talk about, you'd want to probably pick a different mic. There are other dynamic mics. This is similar to an SM58. It's actually the PG58. Also a dynamic mic with a windscreen, so that when you're singing, your plosives don't distort the microphone. There are also larger diaphragm dynamic mics. This is a Shure SM7B, and it's designed more for vocals or for broadcast. Each of these is going to have a slightly different flavor, and it's kind of your job to learn the flavors of the microphones that are at your disposal so that you know when to use them and in what situations. The reason that a dynamic mic is such a good isolator is because not only is it less sensitive than its condenser brethren, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, but it's also typically unidirectional. That means that its pickup pattern is only in front of it. And as you come around to the side, and especially the very back, the microphone is actually rejecting the sound, not perfectly, but you can hear that the front of the mic is absolutely where it's picking up most of its content. There are other patterns besides unidirectional, which is also called cardioid, shaped like a heart, and rejecting what's in the back. There are figure 8 microphones that pick things up in exactly the figure 8 and reject the sides, but not front and back. And then there's the omni mic, which is basically a 360-degree pattern trying to pick up the sound from everywhere as best that it can. Again, if you don't want those other patterns, a dynamic mic is generally going to be the unidirectional, easy to isolate, you point at what you want and reject the rest. The other reason a dynamic mic is chosen for live situations is that it's less sensitive and it's less likely, therefore, to create feedback. So when I'm trying to turn up a sound, let's say this is on a tom, the drummer's hitting the tom lightly. As I turn it up, I'll hear more of that. But if I turn it up too much, then I'm likely to create a feedback loop as the monitors or the mains start getting picked up by this mic. Dynamic mic is less sensitive, so theoretically I'm going to have more headroom before the feedback kicks in, as long as I've got it nice and close to my sound source. The next mic we're going to talk about is the condenser microphone. There are others, but we're not going to get into those for right now. We want to talk about the two most common. A condenser microphone is generally going to be much more detailed, much more fragile, much easier to break, much more sensitive to SPL levels, but you're going to get what people will usually consider a more detailed recording, a more hi-fi sound, a more expensive sound, some people will call it. And the reason that a condenser tends to get a better sound is that the diaphragm that's used is much thinner, and it requires phantom power, which is an electrical current that travels through the mic cable, in order to work. So if you have an older mixing board, or let's say you've got a keyboard amp that has maybe some inputs for microphones, unless there's phantom power on that keyboard amp, your condenser mics aren't going to work with that. You got to have phantom power to run your condenser, or if there's a battery or an external power supply for your condenser. In this case, this is a tube condenser, so it comes with an external power supply, and I don't need to run phantom power to it for that reason. This particular condenser is a large diaphragm, and it has a switch on the back to select 3 different patterns. I can select the unidirectional pattern, the figure 8, or the omni. Whatever I need, this does a pretty good job at picking the pattern. The condenser mic usually works great on just about any source as long as the SPLs are not too high for the rating on the microphone. If the kick drum is kicking out a whole lot of air, then it's possible that you might not want to use a large diaphragm condenser right in the port of the kick drum, because all that air and all that SPL could, especially if the mic has a very low SPL threshold, could stretch out the diaphragm and do damage to the microphone. So it is more fragile, and because it's more sensitive, it's also much more likely to cause feedback in a live situation. You can, of course, use a condenser mic on a live stage. Drummers use condensers as overheads all the time. As a sound guy, you just have to be aware that your chances for feedback are a lot higher, and you've got to be on your toes. The more condensers that are on the stage, the worse the chance for feedback. If you are going to use a condenser on stage, try to limit it to just the drum overheads, or at least something that it's going to be really close to so you don't have to turn it up very much. I really would not recommend putting a condenser up for 3 vocalists to stand 2 or 3 feet away from and try to harmonize into. That's a recipe for feedback for sure. This is a small diaphragm condenser, and it's a little bit different from its brother, the large diaphragm, in that it's shaped like a pencil, and rather than being a side address, you kind of point this just like you would one of the dynamic mics like a SM57. This is usually exactly what you want to go to for something like choral recording or orchestral recording, because it does a much better job at a distance. The sound that's creeping in from the room, the ambient sound, also is going to sound better with a small diaphragm condenser. So you kind of win on both levels. Also very common for a small diaphragm condenser to work on an acoustic guitar, any sound source that you want to have the transients, that is the attack of the sound, be captured accurately. So as I'm trying to pick the holy grail microphone out of my mic locker for my famous whatever player, I kind of look at each mic and try to realize what each one's good for. I understand that if we're going to be playing with a bunch of people on stage, it's going to be a pseudo live or a live show, I might want to pick the dynamic mic because it will be less likely to pick up bleed from other instruments, which will help me isolate my famous whatever player better. If he's going to be isolated well enough, then I might choose a condenser microphone. It could either be a small diaphragm condenser because I happen to like the way that sounds, which is going to be very, very accurate, or perhaps I really like the sound of the large diaphragm condenser because it has a color that for some reason I think flatters the whatever. One of the things you have to realize is that a microphone's placement is crucial to the sound that you get. Suppose my hand is a guitar amp. I can have this mic right up against the center of the cone, just a ½ inch away. I can move the mic to the edge of this cone, the side of the speaker, which gets it off the center. That's going to mellow out the sound. I can turn the mic 45 degrees off axis. That's going to change the sound as well. Or I can just pull the mic back away and see what type of sound I get as I get to 4 inches, 6 inches, 12, 2 feet. All those things are going to change the way that the guitar sounds. And so you want to experiment, assuming you have a good idea of what the final picture is going to be for the song. In a classical setting, the condenser microphones that are 15, 20 feet away from the choir, those can be raised by a couple of feet or lowered. You can get them closer or further away. You can spread them out so that they are wider or nearer to each other. And all these things are going to change the sound as well as just picking what type of microphone. So we're going to be looking at 3 different situations. The first is a large diaphragm condenser mic for vocals, and then we're going to pull this down and try the same type of situation out with a dynamic microphone and see what the difference is. Then we're going to move to the acoustic guitar and do a similar experiment with a small diaphragm condenser and a dynamic mic. And then finally the electric guitar over there with a dynamic mic versus a large diaphragm condenser. And just listen to the differences in sound. And to do this, we're going to be running everything through one of my favorite new audio interfaces, the Audient ID22. Okay, so first up is the large diaphragm condenser, and I'm going to do my best bluegrass impression, and then we'll try it out with the dynamic mic. In the deep, dark hills of eastern Kentucky, that's the place where I trace my bloodline. Let's try the other mic. Okay, so here's the Shure SM7B, the dynamic mic. It's a different design, a lot cheaper. Maybe it sounds just as good for the source. We don't know yet. Let's give it a try. In the deep, dark hills of eastern Kentucky, that's the place where I trace my bloodline. We're moving to the acoustic guitar now. We're going to start with the condenser mic, the small diaphragm condenser, and see how it sounds. Okay, now we've got the Shure SM57, which is the classic stage live mic. We'll see how that compares. Okay, so we're moving on now to the electric guitar, and we've got a nice noisy tube amp to mic up. This is a dynamic mic. It's a pricier one, the Sennheiser MD421, and we'll compare this with the large diaphragm condenser. And of course, ultimately, it's probably not going to be a make or break deal, but every little decision is cumulative. You end up with something at the end of the day when you've made 30, 50, 100 little decisions, and if they've all been good, your final product is going to be noticeably better than if you've made 20, 50, 100 bad decisions. So sure, this microphone versus another one in the course of an entire project is not going to be a huge deal probably. But the choice of every single microphone throughout the entire project is going to add up. The cumulative effect will be significant. Well, that concludes our little audio test of dynamic mics and condenser microphones. There are, of course, other types of microphones. There are ribbon mics, there are PZMs, but these are the most common ones. These are the ones you're going to find no matter where you go. If you walk into a high school or a college or a performing arts hall or some theater or some auditorium, these are the types of mics that will be ready for you to use in order to record the performances that happen in these places. So I hope you get a chance to listen to the differences and at least open up your ears to the possibility that when you're making decisions, it's a good idea to play with all your options. That includes the different types of mics, the placements of those mics, and keeping in mind the final picture, what's going to happen at the end of everything, how these pieces are going to fit together and what you're trying to accomplish. Thanks.